Perfect. Well, welcome everybody. Bienvenue tout le monde, Ani Kinaweya. We are so happy to have you here today for another series in our FishCAST Seminar Series. Just to give you just a brief introduction, if you haven't been here before, although I have been seeing familiar names and faces pop up, so I'm really pleased about that. But my name is Dr. Christina Semeniuk, and I am the director of FishCAST, which is an NSERC-funded CREATE training program. And it's one of the only right now freshwater graduate training programs in Canada where we're really looking to train the next generation of amazing Canadian scientists in the freshwater fisheries realm of conservation and management. We're a community, we're a team, we're really building, we're in our second year, but we're really excited about the opportunities that we have here as a program. And so as a community, we're trying to work together with our graduate student trainees, as well as our postdoctoral fellows, even our undergraduates, to move beyond land acknowledgements and that are typically given and more into the realm and the sphere of meaningful partnership and relationship building, that where we can actually acknowledge the history, the connection to, and the knowledge of the land on which we're situated. For instance, I'm coming to you today from Kingsville, Ontario. That's Treaty 2. And I'm privileged to be able to work and do research and live in the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which include the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. But again, moving beyond these standard acknowledgements, we really want, as a community of FishCAST, to address systemic barriers in our fields and to find people and allies to work with, to try to find ways to overcome these systemic issues that we're experiencing, particularly in the freshwater fisheries realm. After all, we are all will continue to be treaty land inhabitants. And in spirit and in theme of this, I'm so happy to introduce you today to our speaker, Derek Kroeker, who is a fisheries manager with Manitoba Department of Natural Resources and Northern Development in the Fish and Wildlife Branch. Derek received his technical training at Lethbridge College, and then he completed both his bachelor and master's degrees at the University of Manitoba, in which he still feels very, very strong connections to. Derek also manages fisheries in the eastern region of Manitoba, as well as collaborating with a bunch of different branch staff on province-wide initiatives. In fact, Derek is actually incredibly knowledgeable and has extensive experience on many freshwater fisheries conservation and management issues. And these include the Manitoba Recreational Angling Strategy. He's an expert in fish stocking, as well as the Manitoba Master Angler Program, of which he is a member, and I believe he's got some silver badges in it, and which I'm sure he'll be happy to talk about, as well as experience in repopulating sturgeon, and again, working in very diverse communities and with people with different ways of knowing. And again, we're so happy to share Derek's knowledge with you today, where he'll be telling us about bringing your work into the light, communicating scientific information to resource managers and the public. And so without further ado, can you please join me in welcoming Derek and his talk today at the FishCAST Seminar Series. Welcome, Derek.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. That goes well beyond anything that I could have ever imagined to talk about myself. I really appreciate that. Maybe just a little bit about where I'm sitting today. I am sitting in Lac du Bonnet, Manitoba. That's about an hour and a half northeast of Winnipeg, and it's right at the edge of the Canadian Shield and the Canadian Prairies, where we have very diverse fisheries, right from channel catfish all the way to lake trout. So a wide variety of different fish that we have in this area. I'm going to start up my presentation here and share my screen, but I'm going to keep on talking as I do that. And just want to make sure that we're all able to see what's happening here. So hopefully you can see my first screen. If I can, I got a thumbs up, which is great. Just maybe a little bit more about myself in one sense, in that, you know, I'm not trained as a professional communicator by any stretch of the imagination. Most of what I've learned about communication has come from the School of Hard Knocks, essentially by making mistakes in communications. So much of what I'm talking about today is not necessarily new. It's probably could be found in other publications or perhaps online. But this is sort of a conglomeration, you might say, of the things that I've, I guess, picked up over the years. Also, this presentation is meant for you to absorb, not necessarily to take notes for. So if you are a a note taker who needs to write everything down, or if you are a computer keyboard wizard and your fingers usually fly, I'm going to ask you to take the opportunity to actually put your pen down, to give your fingers a rest and actually just absorb what's about to happen here. Most of what I have are images and not a lot of text. So we will go from here. So again, the title is Bringing Your Work into the Light. I often talk about how, unfortunately, if there can be some fantastic science happening, but if that science is not properly communicated, it unfortunately doesn't reach the ears which it needs to hear. So we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies to get past that. So before we kind of get into the actual talk of the how to communicate, we need to dive into a little bit of the context of where we are right now in terms of how the community or society views science. It may not be surprising to you to know that in some cases there's a significant amount of distrust in science, and this is something we need to overcome. And I want to give you a couple of examples of why this might be. This first image is a picture of a child on a beach being sprayed with DDT powder. DDT was a very powerful chemical that was very powerful for insects, would kill insects. But as you can see on the side, it also said harmless to humans. Now, of course, this was widely used in agriculture and was sprayed on people as well as crops. And what we, of course, learned since the 1940s is that people exposed to DDT have a dramatic increase in cancer rate. It caused a widespread decline of birds across North America due to failed reproduction with the thinned eggshells. So, and I even have a personal connection with this chemical. I was raised on a potato farm in southern Manitoba, and I remember in the 1980s still actually having this chemical in our garden, and I would actually use it. I would scoop it up with my bare hands, put it into a flower duster, and shake this chemical onto potato plants. So I can actually remember as sometimes the wind would waft it into my face. I actually know what this chemical tastes like. I've had it in my mouth. So it's actually kind of ironic that, this is something I've experienced myself. DDT also led, actually in one positive realm, you might say, led to Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which if you've not read it, I suggest you read Silent Spring. It really was the beginning of North America's environmental movement. And it's a very powerful book, but it's because of DDT that it came about. Another very serious, I guess, issue that happened in the past, in the 1950s and 60s, was thalidomide. This was a drug given to women who suffered from nausea in the early portions of pregnancy. And at the time, it was deemed safe, of course, but over time, it became linked to many, many birth defects, and in fact, many stillborns and miscarriages. So it was extremely unfortunate, obviously, but also very damaging to how people viewed science, because at some point, of course, people were prescribed this with the knowledge that this would be good for them, not bad for them. But of course, it turned out that it was bad. Now, on a much lighter note, the great debate of butter versus margarine. So again, I will tip my cards here a bit. I'm approaching the 50-year mark, and I think over the course of my time, people have told me, whether it be the media or scientists through the media, that at one time butter was better for us than margarine, and I think it's flip-flopped now from margarine to butter, and then back to butter to margarine again. And it's challenging in the topic of human health and diet. There's so much information out there, and there's so much, I believe, also misinformation, but also information that's been corrected over time. So at one time we were told that all animal fats were bad for us and we shouldn't be eating any of them. So then, of course, people were pushed towards margarine. However, now that we don't know about trans fats and margarine has that, then that was also bad. But then cholesterol was deemed bad. But now not all cholesterol is bad. Butter's a natural food. Canola's made from, or margarine's made from canola, which is a genetically modified plant. So you can see that there's all this mixed communication and mixed information that comes to us from science, sometimes interpreted by the media. So what happens? What has happened with all this, different types of information? Well, first of all, in your upper left corner, you'll see that the general public doesn't like this. They don't like to be given information that they find later on to be wrong. Now, I want to take a bit of more of a sidebar here. I always think that science is not necessarily wrong, right? Science is self-correcting. If science goes down a wrong path and it's proven to be that there is something that is harmful, science that can then correct and direct us back towards research that goes down a different path and leads us towards more safety, or we at least get better knowledge of things. But the public doesn't see it that way. The public sees us as being wrong, and that we haven't corrected it, that we were wrong. Now, this is all causing skepticism of science, and of course, right now, I think we're in a day and age where science faces a lot of headwinds. And in the lower right corner, with this gentleman pointing, I did this specifically because you joined the scientific fraternity, you are also now part of the problem, and the public will see you as someone to be skeptical of. Now, that may not sit very well with you, but I want to give you a bit of an example of how distrust of science affected my work. So I have, in many parts of my job as a resource manager, as a fisheries manager, have done public meetings, and in some cases it was through commercial fisheries or recreational fishing. I was at a commercial fishing meeting, and I was about to start, and there was about 30 or 40 people in the room, and a person approached me and said, "Whatever you have to say, I know will be wrong, and I believe everyone else in this room rather than you." I was pretty sure that what I was about to say was information that only I had, that I was going to present a stock report that hadn't been published at all, hadn't been reported. So I knew that I had novel information, but one individual had already basically had predetermined that no matter what I said, it was going to be wrong, and it was going to be not accepted. So now that you know where we're starting from, this is our starting point. I haven't really talked about communication yet. Now that you know where we're starting from, we need to look at how to communicate your science to the public and to resource managers. So let's now dig into the actual topic. I want to give you this perception. First of all, each person that you encounter has had a certain set of circumstances that have led them to be who they are at that point and what they believe, right? So each person's going to be coming with a very different perspective. I personally like to think that as an opportunity, right? There is an endless opportunity of how you can interact with people and small groups. And I want to dare you to be optimistic. I want you to not take what I've just said in terms of the challenges and say this is insurmountable. I want you to see the positive side, that people can be told new information and they can incorporate that into what they think and how they behave. But it's a challenge, and you have that challenge for yourself. This is something that is something that you need to work on specifically. And what I think is a good way to start is interacting with a person one-on-one. And when you see a person, let's say you're doing your research and someone approaches you, or perhaps someone is, you're at a party and someone asks you what you do, it is your chance. It's your chance to then describe what you do. And like in this case with this person who's ice fishing here, you need to imagine what this person is going to ask you, right? And you need to figure out how your work will connect with this individual. Now, I understand fully that many of you have a wide diversity of science that you're working on, but let's just say you are working on catch and release mortality of fish. Well, likely you will have a very easy time finding a way to talk about your research to this person, because they're going to likely be very interested. Now, if you're working with a project on the mitochondria of the spiny dogfish, this might be more of a challenge, right? Because you will need to find a way to make the connection of what you do and how that will impact this specific person. So you'll need to be creative. However, the good news is if you are already working on the mitochondria of spiny dogfish, you have some time to think about exactly why you're doing your research and how it might be applicable to, let's say, an angler, or maybe it's somebody in the healthcare field, right? Or in other areas. So you need to be very purposeful about what you're going to communicate and why it's impactful to that person. So that is where you need to start thinking about which different types of people from different walks of life may react differently to your science. So as I mentioned, you need to make a connection, because in order for your message to be heard and not just listened to, you will have to build some kind of relationship. And in some cases, you only have seconds to make that connection. You may have heard of people doing or talking about an elevator talk, where essentially you need to get your point across in the matter of 20 or 30 seconds, I guess, depending on how tall your building is or how slow your elevator is. You may only have 20 or 30 seconds really to give one little piece of your science to somebody, and you're going to have to do that very quickly. And I'm going to make another dare to you. I'm going to ask you to dare to assume. Now, I know in today's age, you're often told not to assume, right? Not to judge a book by its cover. Don't assume something that you've seen is accurate or is true. But to be honest, we all do this, especially with our eyes. When we see people, we immediately are looking for clues to their body language, to how their faces react to what we say. Our bodies are constantly, our minds are constantly making assumptions based on the information we get, especially our visual information. Our brains are wired to look for clues, to get clues as to whether that person is understanding you, whether they are going to accept what you have to say, or or the opposite, that through their facial features are showing you that they don't believe what you have to say. So we actually are able to make some assumptions, and I am going to encourage you to do that. So a few communication tips. A few things that I think work very well when we are interacting with individuals and small groups. One of them is to use your humility. In this little diagram I have here, there's this very delicate balance between confidence and humility. And of course, if you're overconfident, you may appear arrogant. However, if you use self-deprecation, or if you're really downplaying the interaction or the importance of your work, you're really not doing justice to your topic. And so you have to find this balance between the confidence and humility. One tip that I really like to use when it comes to getting people to find that balance is to say something like, every time I learn something new about my topic, I realize there's 5 more things that I don't understand. When you say something like that, it shows that you're very interested and enthusiastic about your topic. It shows that you are learning and you're creating new information, but it also shows that there's more to learn and that you're not necessarily an expert and that you're not someone who is a know-it-all, because I think the public really shies away from that type of tactic. Secondly, if you can use humor at all, it is so much more beneficial. If you can, crack a smile from someone, and it may relate to your work, or maybe it's just something you talk about the weather as you first, make the first few forays into your conversations. Using humor is always a fantastic way to interact with people. And finally, this is an interesting one. I know that, and I remember very clearly being a grad student, and we often talked about our research and what we were doing as a team. The general public doesn't really understand when we do that. When we say, we are working on something, and if you're standing there alone and that person's going to not understand who the we is, it is okay to say, I am working on something. This is where you can take ownership, because I think that's very important. When we take ownership of our science to the community, to the people you're talking about, they know that you're heavily invested. It's not something that you happen to be working on like an assembly line. It's your work. And when you get that impassioned about it, people will understand that it's very important to you, and you'll have an easier time having people interact with you. Now, you might say, I don't really like talking to people, or it's not in my nature to talk to people. And you might say, well, I'm an introvert and I prefer not really to do this. Now, in my mind's eye, it doesn't really matter if you're an extrovert or an introvert. At some point, you will have to practice these connections. You have to practice these communication styles. If you're an extrovert, you might say, well, this is no problem for me. I talk like this all the time. The problem is sometimes an extrovert, and I tend to fall into this classification more often than not, is that sometimes we actually use too many words without enough meaning, right? We tend to ramble or babble a bit too much. And for some people, as we're interacting with them, we may not be clear enough about the actual scientific piece that we want to communicate. This is actually where introverts shine. So if you're an introvert, this is actually where you can do really well. I find that introverts, when they have an important piece of information they want to share, they've already thought very, very carefully about how they want to articulate that information. And when they do that with very careful words, they can use very few words and have significant meaning in the words. So I'm going to encourage anyone from either side, if you're an extrovert or an introvert, and I actually fully believe that we can actually move fairly freely amongst this continuum scale, that we prepare our words. We think carefully about what our science is, why it's important, and then exactly how it's going to relate to the person who's standing in front of me. Now, why do I have a picture of a child? This reminds me to talk about exactly, to reiterate how important it is to fully understand your topic. You've probably heard it say, or maybe you haven't, that you really don't understand something unless you can describe it to a child. And I really believe this is a good practice for all of us to really fully understand our topic, just to be very purposeful and careful to think about what we know about our topic, and then can we actually explain that to a child without using, large language acronyms, without assuming in this case that someone already knows a lot about something. We need to actually be able to do this. And I'm actually pretty serious about finding, you really need to find a child somewhere between the ages of 5 and 10 to actually practice this on. And, if you can borrow a child, I don't, suggest you go and kidnap or, stand at the mall and try to draw children in. That's going to probably cause a problem. But if you have children in your family, if you have friends that have children, I actually encourage you to, befriend them and then, talk to them about what you do. And you'll be very surprised about the types of questions that they ask. Children have this incredible ability, this freedom to ask questions that are important to them. And as they ask those questions to you, you will start to understand maybe some deficiencies in your understanding of your topic. But more importantly, perhaps you'll find better ways and more impactful ways to communicate, not just to children, but to other people as they ask questions. So again, borrow, do not kidnap, and do this with caution. But I'm going to encourage you to find children to talk to about your project. Okay, so now we're going to move on to communicating with resource managers. So again, I'm a fisheries manager. I deal a lot with the public, whether it be anglers or commercial fisheries, First Nation communities, different public interest groups. It's a very interesting, diverse group of people that I get to talk to. And I very much feel very privileged to actually have the job that I have, because I get to interact with so many people in freshwater fisheries. So why do they matter? And if you saw me earlier on at this presentation, this is a picture of my office. And yes, my former biologist decided that this buoy was about as productive as I was. So that's a picture of me. And the question is, why do I matter, or why do resource managers matter to you as grad students or as people who want to convey science? I'd like to think we do matter because we do something for you. We interpret and translate what you do to members of the public, because by and large, my job is to communicate with the public as well as to policymakers. That means the politicians. So I am essentially taking the bits and pieces of the science that you're doing, and I take that information and I am communicating that for you to the public and to public policymakers. So if you can get your ideas across to me in a very clear, decisive way, I will be able to then better take that information and put that into small communication pieces to the people that can really make a difference. So if you have something that you think really can make a difference in this world, in the freshwater fish world, you need to find a resource manager that is in that field of study or that field that's going to be able to communicate your science. And you need to be tenacious with this. You need to be like a dog that is pursuing its prey. You cannot let these opportunities go by. You need to find the resource managers that can best convey your information. So you'll need to know, which people are working on freshwater fish, whether it's a commercial fishery, whether there's indigenous fisheries involved. You need to find that person, and you then need to make that sure that resource manager understands your work and why it applies to them. And this is where, being in the community, finding out who the resource managers are, try to find a way to have some one-on-one time with them, because I think that is actually the best way to convey your information is through one-on-one or small group interactions. So you need to be tenacious as this dog is tenacious. Finally, a little bit about communicating through writing. Most of you probably have to do some writing. It's probably technical in nature. The writing I'm talking about is quite different. It's more of a narrative, more storytelling writing. And the reason I bring it up is that writing provides a very interesting opportunity that you can't get in any other types of communication. Writing presents an idea, and as the person reads it, they can incorporate it at their own pace. If you are giving information to a person verbally, they need to very quickly decide whether they will accept your information or whether they're going to reject your information. And they may feel forced to decide at that moment whether they're going to believe you or not. But when someone reads something, there's no immediate pressure to accept it or to reject it. And often when people read something, they will then incorporate that knowledge into their thought process over time. So where are the places to get your information? I actually prefer local newspapers and regional special interest magazines. I find these to be, especially for people working in freshwater fisheries, the places that they are most likely to get their information. And I kind of like the small town papers because they have very interesting topics, or they have their articles are things that are important to local people. Often they're kind of funny, like breathing oxygen is linked to staying alive, those types of things. And what they are often doing is they're clamoring for content, and they're looking for someone to give a short snapshot of information that their readers can digest. So even though I know most of you are probably less than half my age and probably maybe don't read local newspapers, I'm going to encourage you, if you can, to seek them out, because there are great places for you to practice your writing and to actually interact with quite a few people. Because in most small towns, there'll be several thousand people who will read these newspapers. Now, I understand again, you're half my age, and so you probably are more interested maybe perhaps in digital media, whether that be podcasts or forums, Twitter, so forth. I'm going to offer you some caution. As the world of social media came up, I started communicating some science through some of the fishing forums here in Manitoba. And I found that to be a very ineffective way to communicate science. What I found, unfortunately, there are people who, because they're anonymous, they weren't being held accountable to their words. They would bring up issues and items that were just, there's no way to defend yourself, right? There was no way to actually have a reasonable conversation through those forums. So I'm going to caution you against that. I understand it might seem attractive to do that. Now, podcasts I think are different. A podcast is something that you can do and transmit your science very casually. But I'd be very cautious about using the written word in a lot of the digital media today, just because of the way that people interact with them. Essentially, trolls. You guys know what trolls are. People are going to troll you on social media. So be very, very cautious about spreading your science in that way. Okay, I'm almost done. We need to get to some reality here. Just like the Leafs are never probably get past the first round, as we've seen here again. You're going to find that some people are just not going to want to like what you have to say. Some people are going to distrust you immediately. And I want to tell you why that is. Essentially, when you're asking someone to believe something that they haven't believed before, you're asking them not just to change their beliefs, you're asking them to change their team, right? You're asking them to change the very people that they associate with, because obviously all the people that are wearing blue here are cheering for the same team. But if there's a group of people that have a very strong perception about science, you're asking them to change not just their belief system, but their team, which is very difficult. So don't expect people to change their minds immediately. Please be patient. So even again, as the Leafs are of course wrong, people don't like to be wrong, and they'd they'd rather stay in their team than to jump ship, you might say. So I'm going to summarize here. If you want to have your science mean something to the world outside of academia, you will need to drive the process. And I get it that you're a grad student and you have a lot on the plate, but it's actually up to you to drive the process of communication outside of your small group right now in academia. You will need to prepare a number of different ways to present your information. And I encourage you to just take small pieces, not in your entire thesis, small pieces of your information, and prepare speeches. You'll need to find resource managers to help spread your message. And perhaps you'll also find places to have your message spread through print as well. The title of my topic was to bring your work into the light. And perhaps the most important part of this, again, is that the opportunity that you have is in your hands. It's up to no one else to do this. It's not up to your professors, your advisors. It's not up to the university. It's really going to be up to you. I fully believe that knowledge is power, and each one of you must choose whether you're going to share this knowledge or not, and it's very powerful. And with that, I want to just leave you with one short little example of how science messaging has changed attitudes that I've experienced over the last 30 years or so. So in Manitoba, if you were to ask an angler 30 years ago about which fish they should keep, which sizes of fish they should keep, they'd always say they should keep the very biggest fish and let the smallest fish grow. Let them go and let them grow. Of course, we know that harvesting big fish tends to be the very largest females in the population, and in some cases can be quite harmful to a fish stock because you're taking out the very largest, most productive in terms of egg potential out of the population. And over the last 30 years, people's perceptions have changed. We as scientists have been telling people it's actually better to eat the smaller fish and let the bigger fish grow. And as there's enough reproduction, you can always harvest some of the small fish. Well, recently we did a new strategy for angling in Manitoba, and we presented it to the public in some very unique ways. We did podcasts, we did an online survey, something called through Engage in Manitoba. And what we got as responses from Engage Manitoba was the public telling us to further protect large fish by putting a prohibition on the harvest of large fish across the board, and encouraged us to focus the harvest on small fish. So now, 30 years past, we've actually had the public completely change their ideas on the harvest of large fish. And they use that science to actually further encourage us to do what we think is the right thing. So I just want to share that at the end here to demonstrate the fact that it is possible to have the public change its mind over time, but sometimes it does take some time. So with that, I think I will stop the presentation and we can go to some questions.
Thank you so much, Derek. Can the audience help join me in thanking Derek for that really, really enlightening talk? So thanks so much. So
my pleasure.